I am told that if everybody is quiet, the microphone will work. Is that true? Can you hear me? Great. Okay, well, it's a very great pleasure for me to welcome everybody tonight. My name is Barbara Graziosi. I'm one of the directors at the Institute of Advanced Study in Durham. I'm particularly looking after the arts and humanities sides of things, but I'm delighted to say that our overall director in charge is sitting right there. She's Veronica Strang. She's just joined us from New Zealand. She's full of ideas, plans, enthusiasm for what is going on at our institute, and I hope you'll take the opportunity later to talk to her and find out more about what is going on in Durham at our institute at the moment and what will go on in the future, because I think that's very much Veronica's way of thinking at the moment. My role tonight is really just to welcome everybody, to introduce our speakers to the audience and vice versa, our lovely audience to the speakers, and say thank you to everybody for making this event possible and explain briefly what this is about and why we're here. And then I'll just sit back, ask some questions and let you get on with it, and that's the plan really. After I ask some questions, I'll invite everybody to intervene in our discussion, so please ask any questions that you'd like to ask. I've been told you should stand up so that for technical reasons your voice can be better recorded, and I also hope it's okay if we're filming this event, because it might help us show off in Durham when we go back. Basically that's the plan, so I hope you're all in agreement with that, but if not, just let me know. And
so if you're having an affair, leave now. Yeah. You'll be rumbled.
Or be discreet. We might have no audience, you know.
Sorry.
On that note. So this is, for us, a time of thinking about what our Institute of Advanced Study is about and talking about it with groups of diverse people. And in short, our institute is very young. It's about 5.5, I think. It's housed in a beautiful building between the cathedral and the castle on the Palace Green in Durham. And it offers people place, a space and time to think, really. That's what it's about. But we believe in thinking through conversations. That's very important to what we're trying to do, and we'd like to set up conversations between people who don't usually talk to one another. That means in part interdisciplinary research, which is a trendy term, but in practice it means not allowing people to talk just to other people who are trained in the same way as they are, who are asking the same questions of the same body of evidence in very well-defined ways that have a long tradition behind them, but actually making sure that they talk to people who might be working on similar problems, but coming from an entirely different perspective and angle. So we have a generous fellowship program, and we offer fellowships time to think and to develop ideas, and a good place for doing so, not just to academics, but to artists, to writers, to policymakers, to people working in the arts, and at the interface between industry and science as well. So that's part of what we're doing, but then you may ask, what are we doing here tonight? One thing is that, of course, being based in Durham, it's important every so often to go out and talk to people elsewhere, because it's a lovely place, but it can be quite small. It's also quite cold, which is why I have boots and nobody else does. So once a year at least, we try to put on an event where we're discussing issues that are important to us with people here, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the staff at the Royal Society for the wonderful hospitality. It's been very, very easy to set this thing and to rely on the help, and of course to thank all our staff at the IAS, especially Linda Crow and Audrey Barron and Carmen Thompson. I can't see her, but yes, there she is, modestly at the back, but very important, and Paul Gink for all their help. And what I thought I might offer, given that I'm a classicist by background, is to start thinking about ancient Athens and how people in ancient Athens put across ideas, made ideas important to public decision-making, to debates across very different interests and tensions in what was then a very small community. And to try and think about how ideas mattered to them and were put across then, and how we might achieve and set up useful conversations between different people now. And it is my absolute pleasure and joy that when I thought about who might be good to have talking about these issues, I thought about 3 people. I wrote to them and they all said yes, and here they are. And I am absolutely delighted about that, because they are experts in the ancient world, but they are also influential public voices on a variety, on an impressive and rather intimidating variety of issues today. So it is very apt, I think, to have them here, and I'd like to thank them very much for coming, and I'll now introduce them briefly. We have Professor Edith Hall at King's College London. She is not, she told me in an email, a public intellectual, because those only happen in France. She is, I can't remember what you said, but I think opinionated higher education worker. So here she is. And I have to say it's not an entirely off-the-mark description. And
oh, Hugh, oh, Hugh.
Really.
Hugh, yeah.
And an expert, really, on ancient democracy and drama, one of the most significant leading voices in that field of research, but also an opinionated speaker on other issues too. We have Bettany Hughes, who will be familiar to you from many television programs, some of them on antiquity, but by no means all. The latest was Divine Women, so maybe your title is Divine Woman, but
we're all divine women.
All. And what I thought was particularly useful for this debate tonight is your book on the Hemlock Cup and Socrates and the Search of the Good Life, which is about how people talked to one another and looked for things in the setting of classical Athens. And then we've got Charlotte Higgins, chief writer at The Guardian.
Chief arts writer. I'd love to be
arts is the only thing that I'm only interested in the arts, so that's arts writer in The Guardian, and talking about a really mind-boggling array of different issues, but originally a classicist by training, which is what interested me. And I will ask you later whether that's, a good place to start, or what, how that links up with all the different things you're talking about in your work. I am especially pleased that Charlotte came, because I never met her before. So I just wrote an email out of the blue and said, I'm trying to organize this. I think ideas matter. We need to support our institute. We need to talk to people, have conversations. And she said, yes, I'll come. And that was, one of those moments where you think, okay, you don't need to know people. You just need to get to know people and have conversations. And that's, I think, very heartwarming for me. So thank you very much for coming, and please welcome our speakers. So Edith, I'll start with your professorial authority on classical Athens, and I'd like to know how ancient democracy worked, how decisions were made in classical Athens, and how people talked to each other in order to arrive at a common decision on major issues. So it seems to me that's something we also need to think about.
Absolutely, we have so very much to learn from them. I see Greco-Roman antiquity as, in a way, this alternative universe that we can sort of go into when we've got things we want to talk about, because in some ways they were vastly more sophisticated and advanced than we are. Lots of ways they weren't. We all know what sort of mistakes they made. They made huge mistakes with slavery and with gender politics and with imperialism. But in some other respects, especially one or two particularly precise moments in ancient history, they got so much further than we ever had. And I really do believe that about Athenian democracy. And it's not actually very fashionable to praise Athenian democracy. It's regarded as slightly old hat, and what about the slaves and what about the women? But what the ancient Athenians did, Bettany's going to talk about the role of an intellectual or significant intellectuals in public in shaping opinion and testing people's decisions. What interests me far, far more than that myself is making the public intellectual. And that is what classical Athens did in a quite extraordinary degree. We don't know that much about the democratic revolution of 507. We don't know exactly when the various institutions and apparatuses that basically made the executive decisions of the state, became fully functional and fully operative. But what we do know is that by about 480 BC, the citizens of Athens, who are the 30,000 or so, estimates vary a lot, 30,000 or so free males, right, were direct democrats. That is, they did not have members of parliament, they were not represented, they represented themselves. Each voice had the same vote. And all of them would go along to the thing called the assembly, which was actually just a sort of open-air meeting place up the hill from the market square. They were rounded up onto the hill. And decisions were taken with alternative speakers, sometimes more than 2, and sometimes perhaps 10 on a particular issue. And it was done on clapometer, if you like. It was done on noises of praise and blame. The loudest noise won. Your voice counts it, right? Now, of course, there's all kinds of ways that corruption can get in and the clacks can get hired and all that kind of thing, of course. But this helplessness that I certainly felt, I mean, the example that always comes through to me, having, with great enthusiasm, voted the Blair government in over the war, the Iraq War. I mean, and that was such a shattering experience for me because I do not regard us as living in a democracy. We do not live in a democracy. The demos, which is us, does not have the kratos, which is the executive authority, the sovereign power. We just don't have it, right? We elect people, you know, once every 4 or 5 years. You go off to Parliament and they do what they like, and they do it according to their leaders, and then their leaders decide to go to war and invent dodgy dossiers. You know, that is how it is for me. Now, the thing about classical Athens that is really exciting, though, most people know they had this assembly and they put up their hands and they shouted and they voted. But they had, to me, the much more important body was the council. And the council is, in Greek, the boule, which means the place where you deliberate. Now, it's ultimately from the same root as words like will and volo and wish. You know, it's where the will of the people is considered, but it's the consideration that really matters. Now, the thing about the council is that every single member of Athens, every one of those 30,000 citizens probably sat on it at some point in his lifetime. You had to sit on it for a whole year. All classes went on it. Money was introduced to help the poor citizens go on it, so because they couldn't be working in their factories or leather shops down in the Piraeus, the working class ones. And you had to sit in it all day, every day, except for festivals and holidays, for a whole year, and deliberate the kinds of decisions that were going to be put to the assembly before they were put to them. All right, that is the level of intellectual engagement, right, required of the most, least educated, least rich citizen of these ideal free men. Yeah. Was about 50 times, what any of us ever, is expected to do in our lifetimes. The idea that we would go and sit, if you've done jury service, you begin to get some kind of understanding of how hard that is. They had to be literate. That's when literacy swept Athens. They had to be. We hear about the drawing boards where the data is put up for the public accounts. They deliberated the public orphans, the public pensions, the navy, the festivals. They took annual reviews. Every one of the actual elected top guys, the generals and the magistrates, every single one of them was accountable completely every single year for every penny. Every single penny. And anybody was allowed to bring him before the council and sue him for corruption, and absolutely everybody. So you'd actually got, basically, what I really want to say is people taking responsibility for their own lives, their own decisions, having to think about things in an extraordinarily scientific way. And we see this reflected in Plato and Aristotle, who develop, and the historians of the 5th century. We know that the Greeks basically developed an 8-point plan for how to make a decision, right? Which every school child in our country should be being taught. Basic moral philosophy from the age of 11, without a doubt. And I bet you all want to know what the 8-step plan is for making a sensible decision. Well, it's really very, very basic things. It's like investigate all precedents, right? You've got to make a decision about, do we fund the army this year, or shall we have hold a particularly big Panathenaea, or shall we consider invading Sicily? Okay? You consider all precedents. You get in a disinterested advisor. You must find an advisor who will not benefit or lose either way. Absolutely crucial. You must find experts in all the technological aspects of it. And that's why Plato's always banging on and on and on and on about why you go to a woodworker if you want to know about carpentry, why you go to the philosopher if you want to know. Okay. You calibrate likely outcomes. So you actually calibrate likelihood as far as you possibly can in terms of sort of percentages. You consider all possible contingencies you can't control, like the weather, things like that. What will we do if it rains? What will we do? You know, there's a set of rules that all these citizens knew about, right? They had to sit and come to those decisions on the council. Now, I'm sorry, but I mean, I'm so upset about the dumbing down of our public, who I regard as totally intelligent. And all I want to do is get hold of everybody, every taxi driver I've ever been with, and just do some basic ethics, because they did this so much better than we did. And I feel very, very, very passionately about this, especially as I'm by nature a great hothead and temperamental and want to make decisions. You know, I'm very emotional, I have very strong emotional reactions. Studying the Greek deliberative code has made me so much wiser and more sensible, because I sort of make myself do it when, you know, the worst moment when you've had 4 glasses of claret and you're about to send that email, you know, it's like, no. What would Aristotle? You know, my husband has now banned me from doing email after 9 at night. I mean, I'm just not allowed. It's just not because I will almost certainly have had 4 glasses of claret by then. So, but it's that expectation that, of course, if it's your state, you've got to die for it, because these guys did. They had to go out and fight for it. So you obviously need to know, as far as you are possibly able, about every single aspect you have thought about, deliberated about. So we had to train these guys, and I think you're going to ask me about theatre.
Yes, that's right. She's making my life so easy. So,
Sorry.
You know, how did the theatre then come in to this education of the citizens? And more specifically, I mean, I know theatre taught a lot of different things, but it also taught, you know, it helped people think about decision making. And that's something that, when I heard it from you, secondhand from you, was new to me. I hadn't thought about how tragedy and comedy teach people not just about life in general, but also about making decisions. Decision making, yeah. And that is something that I wanted to ask you about, partly because I didn't hear the full story first time around.
It's whether to try to describe it abstractly or through an example. I think the best thing is through an example. In Greek tragedy, you have 2 things battling it out. One is luck and bad luck, and the other is human error, right? Making mistakes. Now, Oedipus, we all know, was doomed before he was even born, right, to sleep with his mother and marry his father. So in his play, he basically suffers the worst possible luck in the world, right? Completely bad luck. However, there are many occasions in the play, the Oedipus Tyrannus of Sophocles, where the way that he reacts and the people around him react to emergency, there are actually alternatives. And Sophocles goes out of his way to display all the different alternatives. And particularly the speed with which he goes in and stabs his eyes out when he discovers his wife. Right? In a later play, where he says, I know I did that too quickly. I acted
the deliberative plan of
no. And he says,
he sent that email.
And do you know what the chorus say when he comes out? They said, we don't think in this particular instance you deliberated very well about your course of action. They do! They do! They use this boule stem, the boule stem. Boule thigh, top boule thigh. They actually use it. Okay? And So at one end you've got that extreme, which is if you have the worst possible luck, and sometimes that happens, we all know it happens, people get, families wiped out in road accidents, terrible, terrible things happen in human life, which are, uncontrollable, cannot be avoided. But how you then respond to that is incredibly important. On the other hand, you have, and I don't know if any of you have been to see the Antigone with Christopher Eccleston and Jodie, the Antigone, the play that made Sophocles, people in antiquity said, it may not be true, it doesn't matter whether it's true or not, but they said he had been elected general of the city on the strength of it, because it showed how to be a leader. But he doesn't show how to be a leader, he tells how not to be a leader. In that play, Creon, he's just come into power, he gives his inauguration speech at the beginning, manages to kill his wife, his son, and his niece, cause an enormous amount of pollution in the city of Thebes, and probably set it on the road to total civil anarchy, what's implied at the end, because on about 10 separate occasions he refuses to deliberate in the course of that one day. I mean, it's not luck at all. He is simply the most incompetent ruler in world literature. Even worse than Agamemnon in the Iliad, saying something. It is saying something. Okay, but Greek literature is absolutely jam-packed with competent and incompetent rulers, examples of how to do it, examples of how not to do it. That is what these little boys all grew up on, and girls. They learned the Iliad and the Odyssey off by heart. They went to see these plays, and they're in watching where Creon went wrong, which is just all the time. He acts in speed, in haste, when Haemon comes on and says, please listen to advice from the young. No, when Tiresias comes along, please listen to advice from the gods, which are just another form of counsel for the ancients. That's why you went to Delphi. And do you know what was so great about the ancient oracle? I've cracked oracles. I used to think I could not get my head around the ancients and the oracles. I just couldn't. How could these totally rational people do this? It's quite simple. You could only go to Delphi 10 days a year, 1 day a month, and probably only 10 of the 12 months. If you were going to go and consult at Delphi, you had to slow everything down. And we all know that if you've got to make an appointment with the doctor for 2 weeks' time for what you think is suicidal despair, the suicidal despair may have gone away by the time you get to the doctor. The slowing and then getting the God's opinion in. Why not have some arcane person smacked out on cannabis sitting on a tripod giving you her opinion? She's certainly disinterested.
Thank you. On that note, I'll ask
a Delphi expert.
Expert on goddesses, but I'd actually like you to go very concrete, because one of the things I really like about Bettany's work is that it is very real, very sort of touchable, very in touch with the reality of antiquity, which is something that academics are sometimes a little bit vague on, and I'm certainly not very in touch with reality a lot of the time. But I think that is something that I admire, and I wanted to ask you more specifically to give us a sense of what this community was like, what the streets were like, what it looked like, what it felt like, and then place Socrates in there and get us a sense of what he was up to and how annoying he was.
Very annoying. I think.
But first, tell us about this street.
I will. And just before I answer you, I have to say we were just having a chat before you all came in. It's like, how do we manage to persuade the next government that classics is really valuable? And I think all we need to do is just show the film of Edith's extraordinarily articulate and passionate apology for the classics. Now we should just be playing that on a big screen outside the House of Commons, and classics will come back into the world. I mean, it is exactly as Edith says, this is the most extraordinary moment in time. And extraordinary is a word that is much overused, particularly in television, where it is used every second sentence. But this truly was an out-of-the-ordinary moment. This notion that this little city-state of Athens, and it is a little city-state, suddenly starts to punch so far above its weight. And I think it's very attitudinal. I think the fact that absolutely against the odds, the Greeks have defeated the Persians, the great super enemy from the east, and somehow they've managed to do this. And there is this extraordinary currents of can-do electricity that goes through the streets of Athens. And as Edith says, this notion of democracy, what a mad idea to come out of an ancient world where kings and tyrants and tribes have held sway, and suddenly you say, actually, scrap all that. Even if you're a goat herd, you deserve to sit next to a general and have the same degree of opinion, and your opinion counts to the same level, is an amazing idea. And people love democracy. I mean, we were talking about this before as well, that they start to call, for instance, men start to call their eldest sons democrates. So they give them that name. We were trying to work out what people would call their sons today, given the current politics. It would have to be libcon or something. It just doesn't have the same ring about it. I was in Cornell.
Rotten borough.
Yeah, rotten borough. General corruption.
Scandal.
But somebody was saying, well, it would never happen today. And I was doing a lecture in Cornell, and it's fantastic. Jock guy put his hand up and said, actually, it does happen today that during the revolution in Tahrir Square, the first week of the revolution, one of the revolutionaries got a text through on his phone from his wife saying, I've had a baby girl, you've got a daughter. And he texted back and said, her name shall be Facebook. Because for them, Facebook was the most extraordinarily powerful tool. Well, you don't It's exactly the same as these Athenians calling their sons democracies. So actually, there is this amazing investment in what politics can do. But I think what is a very, very interesting kind of byproduct of this extraordinary world that Edith's been talking about, which is very physical, so I will come to the physicality of it, is that Athens was famously described as a city of words. Because if you come to a decision democratically, that democratic decision has to be publicised to the mass of the population. If you're a tyrant or a dictator, you can just decide on a law and then your lackeys effect it for you. But in a democracy, this has to be communicated. So I think the first thing to think about when you think of Athens is this place that was plastered with the written word. There were steles everywhere, like stone teeth along all the lanes and all the streets, announcing what had been decided in the Democratic Assembly. Athens, people bang on today about Athens and it's covered in red graffiti. It's nothing to the graffiti there was there in the 5th century, where we know it was red again, where again these big ideas were written in red paint on plaster in the walls. And fascinatingly, ordinary people were encouraged to be literate. So when you look at the excavations in the Agora, so the central marketplace, and the Agora gave rise to a whole verb which means to come together, to trade and to talk about politics, interestingly. So the market, this kind of meeting place, became part of what it was to be Athenian. In the excavations in the Agora, there are a huge number of lead tablets with writing on that are being excavated at the moment. And they are two things, basically, these lead tablets. Half of them are curse tablets. So the downside of having a direct democracy, where you can bring cases to the legal courts the whole time, you as a goat herd can bring a general to be judged by 500 good men and true in a court. The problem with this is that people actually become incredibly litigious, and they try to get a kind of magical sorcery on their side. And they do this through writing these curses about one another. So just to sort of slightly temper the wonderful image that Edith has given you of this extraordinarily exciting intellectual and political world, it was also a very angry world, which you realise when you look at the curse tablets. A lot of laws that were passed were exactly the kind of laws that we would all pass as NIMBYs today. So Solon, who generates this kind of proto-democracy, one of the laws that's affected under his control is that neighbours are allowed to dispute how far their fences should be from one another, which is exactly what would happen in, Esher, Surrey today, as well as big decisions about whether you should go to war or not. And in order to try to win these cases, because you're really pissed off with your neighbour because they've built their fence too close to you, you would encourage these kind of spirits onto your side, and you would encourage them by writing these curses against your neighbour. And they are vicious, these things. So there's a particular one which was dug up last year, which says, I would like, when my neighbour comes to the court, I would like his limbs to drop off one by one. I would like to watch as his leg drops off, and then his arm, and then it gets really disgusting. He said, I would like to watch as his eyeball falls out, and with his remaining foot, he squashes his own eyeball into the ground. And you kind of feel, chill, guys, it's all going well. You know, you've got a big empire, you're all fellow Democrats, just relax. So it wasn't, I don't think we should be entirely rose-tinted about it. So this was a very kind of febrile world. But what is interesting is that what those curse tablets tell us, there are curse tablets and there are also ABCs, basically teaching everybody to read and write. So there was an amazing degree of literacy in ancient Athens. So it's this notion that actually, as the common reader was invented, so was the common thinker.
So then what about Socrates? Because he didn't like to write anything. I
No.
mean, he was about talking.
Yeah.
He didn't... what was that about?
So he famously, you will all know this, Socrates, annoyingly for me, because I was trying to write a book about Socrates, and it's very hard when your subject has probably not written a single word down. So difficult to do a history of a man who is entirely elusive. He had an allergy to the written word. And I think this, ties in with Edith's comments about all those emails that we really wish we hadn't written, because he has this fantastic, well, Plato gives him this fantastic passage when he says the problem with written words is that their father is never around to protect them. So they go out into the world unloved, and you can never call them back. You can never call them to account, which is so true, I think. And I remember with the original WikiLeaks scandal with Julian Assange, and all that material came out of the Pentagon, and I thought, I bet those generals really wished that they could be protective fathers to their words that had gone out there. But I think he does have a point, actually. We've now become a civilization in both East and West that relies to a quite extraordinary way on the written word, on these little emails that we send to one another the whole time. And they can be very, very, very dangerous, I think, because writing is a very imprecise tool, in fact, to communicate ideas and emotions, the emotions, again, that Edith was talking about, and truth. And this was a great thing for Socrates. What he says is that by catharsis, I'm trying to bring the bad out of each and every one of us so that we can reach to the good. And we can only do this by face-to-face dialogue, by talking to one another. And I think, actually, he was talking very physically. I think what he meant was so that you can stare somebody, see the whites of the eyes, and see if they really believe in what they tell you they believe. But this was possible in Athens because it was a tiny place. So Athens was, as my lovely research assistant Lucy Feldman, who's sitting at the back, worked out for me this afternoon. We were sitting there working out miles and kilometres. But we worked out that Athens east to west is about 1.25 miles long. So it's a tiny, tiny place. And the bulk of exchange happens in the agora, in the gymnasium, which is a very, very popular place to sit and debate. So actually you could afford to have these upfront conversations. So although Socrates' ideology is interesting, and there is a part of me that feels I want to bring it back into the world, it is in a way entirely unpractical in the world that we live in, apart from occasions like this, where you can talk to us and it's being filmed so people can watch us talking and then can disagree or agree with us honestly.
I think that's important to remember, and to me also in my role with this institute, I do think that it makes a difference if you actually put people together, and you put them together for a period of time, and you enable real face-to-face conversation. That there's no substitute for that at one level. Then once you have that experience that lasts months, you can do video conferencing, you can do emailing, you can do all sorts of things with people, but there is no substitute for that immediate coming together.
Because it forces you, sorry to interrupt, but because it does force you to really say what you think. It's very easy to when you write something down, it's very easy to, with a kind of Weasley use of words, to actually obfuscate the truth of the matter. Whereas if somebody asks you directly, I mean, when I do these talks on Socrates, I had a nightmare once when I sat down in a very democratic, Socratic way and said, so, I've written this book on Socrates, so rather than a talk, let's have a dialogue, between the audience. And slightly smugly thinking, I can answer any question they throw at me. And then somebody put up his hand at the back and said, so, Bettany Hughes, what makes you happy? which of course was one of Socrates' famous questions. And I suddenly found myself flailing with the most sort of pathetic, sentimental nonsense about, well, when my children are safe. You know, this is terrible. But how great, actually, because if he'd emailed me that question, I'd have time to go away, think up a clever idea, you know, and email something astute and cute back. But as it was, you know, he forced me to think on my feet, and it was a rather disappointing result.
But it is something about our full humanity. I mean, it is about that you have that around us. I went to Cairo a few months ago to talk about drama and democracy there at a conference, and it was no substitute to email, to write little articles about it. I was there with the students who started calling me Professor Barbara and kept saying, hold my hand, Professor Barbara, we'll cross the road now, that kind of, you know. And we've become Facebook friends, and we have carried on discussing what is happening there. And it was a very moving event where people were talking about their testimony of what they did, and I can say more about that when they, you know, said, okay, I am going to Tahrir Square, I am doing it, although, you know, my wife is saying, you've got a small child, stay home, you know, that kind of situation. And we were all so taken at the end of the conference that someone, another professor from Greece, you know, absolutely passionate, stood up and said, now all the foreign delegates have to vouch that they're going to be supporting the revolution, the democratic revolution in Cairo. And I was feeling terrible. I was chairing this session. I was saying, what does that mean? You know, what does it mean? What does it mean to support them? What can we do? We are classics professors. And then the guy who was organizing the conference said, well, we have to do what is possible, you know. And then he said, how about occasionally you comment on our students' work if they send it to you? How about you tell us a good topic for next year's conference, you come and you bring some of your friends? How about you send us some of your publications because our library is not up to date? And I was just thinking, this guy is asking us to do our job. I can do this. I can do all these things. I know how to do them. And it's valued and it's important. And then he was saying, you know, the media were there and people were talking, you know, do we have a presidential candidate and so on. And this guy said, you know, for example, we have lots of problems. And I was just thinking, well, what problems is he going to come up with? And he said, there's this girl that wrote a letter to someone random in Cairo University. She's a schoolgirl in Morocco. She wants to read the Iliad. We have done the only translation. It's this big. How am I going to send it there with all these revolutions going on? This is a problem. He's saying, you know, can you help us with this kind of problem? And all of a sudden, it looks small scale, but it also looks meaningful, what it is that we might be doing as classicists also in that.
You know, just there's a really key anecdote that kind of follows on from that. That there's an interesting thing. It's interesting, Edith, that you didn't want to be introduced as a public intellectual because but we have, I think, in the West, we've developed a sort of strange embarrassment about the role of philosophy. Now, I'm not saying that you're embarrassed by it, but generally, we don't like to think that there are philosophers on the street. Cicero famously said that Socrates brought philosophy down from the skies and onto the streets. And actually, this is a broad generalisation, but I spend a lot of time in the Middle East and in North Africa, that there is a lot more street philosophy in those places than there is on the streets of London. And I'll tell you something that happened to me. I was filming a series about the origins of civilization down on the Turkish-Syrian-Iraqi border. So we were really far south and far east. And always when you have a camera with you, you always attract attention. So these little local boys, I mean, not even kind of street kids, dirt poor agricultural farm worker kids came rushing up. And they did the usual thing, that they tried to teach us a bit of Arabic. And they said that they were teaching me to say, I am a woman. But in fact, I then found out they were teaching me to say, I have the face of the back end of a goat, you know. And this was all completely hilarious. But then we did manage to talk. And we found a translator. And I said, what we're down here doing, just to tell you, we're down here talking about the origins of civilization and philosophy and ideas. And one of the little boys, this snot pouring out of his nose, you know, incredibly scruffy hair, no shoes. He said, we have philosophers here. Let me tell you about our philosophers. So he's speaking in Arabic. He said, our philosophers, I can give you 3 names, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle. And this was an 8-year-old boy who I should think probably never gone to school, but somebody in his life had told him, and this is because, again, we forget how incredibly effective Islam was in transferring the ideas of Greek philosophy through to the West. He thought of these names.
Yeah, Melvin Bragg today.
So yeah,
in our time today.
Plato, Socrates and Aristotle as their philosophers. And, you know, that was an extraordinary moment. I thought, actually, I wonder how many 8-year-old kids in London would come up to me and say, let me tell you the names of 3 philosophers. And a friend of mine has since said, yeah, absolutely, you know, that's incredibly likely that Plato, the Arabic version of Plato is Aflatones. He said there are loads of Aflatones around. So there are loads of little Muslim Platos around that we don't even know. So,
well, that's certainly
but
true.
You know, I do think it's something that we should, actually, if we're going to take something from the example of 5th century Athens, that is that we shouldn't be embarrassed about the idea of philosophy being on the streets. And,
but also, I mean, there's a more general thing that came across to me very much, that this is a lingua franca, that we are talking here to people for whom Plato and Aristotle are important, that there is a schoolgirl in Morocco who wants to read the Iliad, and there is therefore a conversation to be had there. You know, so that is very important to me. But I thought I might ask Charlotte more specifically, because I find it quite intimidating, sort of the range of things that you talk about. How does it actually connect to the kind of studies that you've done? And how did that trajectory evolve so that you thought that, you know, how did you develop from a classicist, I suppose is my question, to someone who can comment on a vast range of different issues? I mean, I could ask any of you.
It's a thing perhaps that you post-rationalise, because I didn't sort of graduate with a classics degree and think, how can I apply this to journalism?
Right, yeah.
But I think, you know, after a gap of of many years now, I can look back and see precisely how I've been shaped. And I suspect, you know, any classics graduate or anyone who's been trained in the classics and look back at their life could make a similar, but, you know, a different triangulation of how things worked. But I think there are certain things that are really important to me. One of which, you know, as a writer about culture, that in my heart I come back to a lot, and it's really what it touches on what Edith was saying earlier. It's about the centrality of theatre to a state, to a society. The fact that in Athens the theatre was completely embedded in civic and state life, and yet at the same time was the most powerful, dangerous, critical force. It seems to me extraordinary that something so critical of contemporary politics and leadership could exist at the heart of a city. And I don't think that can be overestimated, actually. I mean, of course, theatre exists in the Western sense because of that example, but, you know, when culture is under fire from politics, from governments, the idea that there is this kind of example right at the very bottom, right at the very beginning of theatre, that is about the relationship between the state and artistic life is extraordinarily powerful. And one sees that, of course, very practically articulated by the fact that when theatres want to discuss something really bad or really terrifying or really dangerous politically, they tend to come back to Greek plays. And I think, as we've all, I think, sort of suggested, that there's an idea. Again, this is sort of something quite personal to me, and I'm not sure it really speaks to your question precisely.
Right,
but the idea that I suppose in my daily life I am dealing with the here and the now, happening in incredibly fast succession. I rarely spend more than a day on a piece of work. I gain a lot of cumulative expertise, but I have to learn very quickly about the here and the now. And there is something very fundamental to my life about having a space where I can think about something that isn't the here and now and is the far away and the long ago. I suppose also something very fundamental about the fact that thinking about the ancient world has no monetary value and cannot be turned into economic life. Yeah. It cannot be monetized. It's something that, you know, lurks very deep inside. And that's, you know, that's not just for, I mean, I'd like to think that's not just the case for soppy humanities graduates such as ourselves. I mean, we're lucky enough to be in this extraordinary, distinguished place, which of course has its foundations in the 17th century and is a humanist. It's a humanist foundation, and at its heart it has great artists like Christopher Wren, and although it's an extraordinary scientific research institution now, its origins predate the sort of bifurcation, trifurcation of thinking about the world, thinking about philosophy, thinking about natural philosophy, thinking about science. You know, those things were together, those things were one thing then, and, you know, I think that's important. I suppose a foundational text for me is Pericles' funeral oration, which is the speech that Pericles gives at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War fought between Athens and Sparta, which was written up by Thucydides, and written up perhaps, I mean, other people, I may stand corrected, but possibly journalistically. I mean, there are lots of speeches in history that are clearly in some way or other invented, or what that leader should, or it might have been good for him to have said.
Thucydides will have been on the very front row.
Right.
He will have been.
Thank you.
He
And
really
so
will.
would his audience.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
right.
So,
yeah.
it's a journalistic exercise. It's an exercise of reportage. So that's important to me, and as is Herodotus's example. These historians are journalists in method, and the way that Herodotus, writing about the Persian War, sifts evidence, tells us about sources, all of those basic historical skills that were formed then are still, you know, are important to me. But I suppose the thing that I found very moving about Pericles' funeral oration, however, I mean, it's sort of absurd in some ways, because he's glorifying the idea of Athens, and Athens, you know, despite what, you know, in addition to what Edith was saying, was also a rather nasty imperialist power who did terrible things to its enemies in the Aegean. But he creates this extraordinary idea of Athens, and there are many, many things in it, but one of the really important things in it to me is that there is more to the citizen's life than the mundane experience. He actually talks about the power of, I mean, he doesn't use these words, which are later, he talks about the power of arts and culture, that not everything is about the day-to-day, that the citizen might do something, might have another kind of experience. And that's a powerful thought, as far as I'm concerned. And finally, journalism is provisional and dialogic, and I'm lucky enough, I suppose I do spend most days talking to people, asking them questions, hearing answers, and having a back and forth with people. You know, that's of course a very Socratic, as Bettany has described, a very Socratic idea. That is what Socrates did. Now, of course, it would be absurd for me to suggest that every journalistic interview is like some kind of amazing Socratic dialogue, because that's clearly not the case. Yeah. But I think in the sense, far from it. But there is a sense in which, by talking to people and asking them questions, that you can arrive at some kind of idea. This is provisional. I mean, I think that's always the thing. Journalism is always provisional, and
everything always provisional.
Yeah.
And do you think? Can I just ask you practically? Do you get a better interview if you are sitting face to face with somebody, as Socrates would have recommended, or could you do it over the phone? Could you do it through an email exchange?
That's a very, very good question. If I was writing a news piece that was talking to 5 people and asking them about why there are so few women on the stages of London, which is what I did today, I would do that over the phone. I would never, ever agree to interview someone at length, at a sort of 1,500, if I really wanted to get a sense of knowing them a little bit. Never, ever would I do that over the phone. And I would always tape it because I want to look at them. So that's... Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm conscious that as well as having wonderful panelists and speakers, we also have a fantastic audience here tonight. And I didn't introduce them, but I do recognize some faces. And we have artists, we have musicians, we have students, teachers, we even have some bankers. I believe there's all sorts of different people in this room that I think would have interesting questions and observations to contribute. I really do hope that this might be an opportunity for you to say things and ask, because it's not every day that I get, or any one of us gets, these people together to talk to us. So are there questions? Yes. Oh, please. Can you stand up as we've been told to do? And yeah.
We come back to the title. It's asking you basically, what was an intellectual and what is an intellectual? And how do you draw the line between an intellectual who's a public figure and a public intellectual? Edith might like to start with that.
Well, she thinks it only happens. Tell us about France, then.
I'm very unhappy with the whole concept. I mean, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have it's good to have a conference about something when I'm unhappy with the word classics, but it's very good to think with exactly how it originated and where. Oh gosh, what is the distinction? I don't think we have any public intellectuals in the way that Socrates represented it. I mean, I like to think that there are some people in the press who do have a jolly good go at political figures, but I don't really get it. I think it's something that Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir invented so they could live in hotels the whole time, and they couldn't actually, couldn't actually make it to sort of cook and so on. I really do think it's a little bit.
Okay, but then let's make it very concrete then, Edith. You had a very difficult experience last year at Royal Holloway. That is something that is a little bit the nightmare of most academics. And it turned into a debate that I would call a public debate, because a lot of different people got involved. And you posed questions that were far beyond the confines of the immediate institutional debate that you were involved in. So, maybe that's not a full answer to what we got by way of, very Socratic, what is this? What is an intellectual? But I think there is a story to be told about how a voice can acquire resonance.
Okay, I still have problems with the word intellectual. I'm sorry, I just do, and I can't get my higher education worker is fine as far as I'm concerned.
Can I just say though, because the origins of intellectual are interesting, because they mean to comprehend.
Ideas.
I know.
So it's a good word. It's not a snobby word. Comprehending the world is quite a good thing. Which is why this
comprehend.
place
All right,
was
I
set
do
up.
not want the next time the cabbie asks me what I do to say, well, actually, I'm a public intellectual. I'm just not going to do it.
No.
I say
Although there
I
was
teach,
a very
teach at
funny,
London University. That's fine.
There was a very funny, The Guardian, actually, about 6 years ago, did a list of the top 50 public intellectuals, and they published their top 50 public intellectuals. And then what was hilarious was obviously the day after, everybody had got on the phone or email and said, actually, I'm a top public intellectual. And they had to run this huge, and a few we missed, and there were about a triple-page spread of people who'd obviously claimed to be public intellectuals.
Anybody who claims to be one almost certainly
isn't. Yeah, I think.
But the particular instance, Barbara, I mean, I do feel I have had to give this quite a lot of thought, because exactly a year ago...
Not intellectual thought, but just thought. Okay, fine.
Deliberative. Right. Exactly a year ago, 28th of June, 2011, I and the other 14 members of the Classics Department, Classics and Philosophy at Royal Holloway University of London were summoned to be told that we were going to be closed down or given the sack except for two of us, blah, blah, it was just ridiculous. And that we had 90 days to prove that we had any part to play in the new business model of Royal Holloway University of London. Now, what I found really difficult was that actually this all really started on the 11th of December of the year before, 2010, when I tried to get a large number of people from Classics nationally on the march the day that the coalition government, after Nick Clegg had said he would not ever abolish government subsidy of fees, right? I tried to get colleagues of mine from all over the country marching. That day, the votes went down from a predicted majority of 34 to 17. All right. Now, I haven't been out on the street with a banner since the poll tax. All right. I'm a quiet stay-at-home mum. But the fact it was a bigger story than that. And we were never allowed the debate in this country. This demos did not get to discuss what it wanted to do with the funding of higher education and research. It never got it. They got into power. Nick Clegg said he wasn't going to do it. Then he did it. Now, I know that fees... So they did something against when the people had voted. More people had voted for parties that said they wanted to continue government subsidy of higher education than had voted for the party that didn't. The majority of us didn't want that. You know, basically all humanities and arts education to be privatised, and it was. We never got that debate. We weren't given the debate. We were given a rush thing of like 3 months, and then it was rushed through on December the 11th, which allowed people like Paul Lazell, who is the head of Royal Holloway, to announce that he's just going to start shutting down departments left, right and centre on the supposition that they weren't going to make a profit in 3 or 4 years' time, having converted us all into a business. We were never given the debate. So a year ago, just purely reactively, this is why I say I don't really think it was intellectual leadership. It was very much a reactive response. When I had tried to get a bit of a debate going the previous Christmas, 4 people turned up, you know. Tim Whitmarsh, I will give the roll of honour here, who's a professor of Greek at Oxford. He got on the Oxford tube down to London to help me carry that banner. Tony Keane from the Open University, who is just an absolute hero. Fiona McIntosh, you had to because she's my best friend, I'd never have spoken to her again. And Helen Eastman, who was a PhD student at Royal Holloway. That was it. That was it. Nobody seemed to actually even be reading the papers to see what was happening. My own colleagues at Royal Holloway said they couldn't come because they were having their Christmas dinner. They were having Christmas dinner, like, well, Rome burns. So it's a kind of not being aware of what's you know, never reading the newspapers. I don't know. It's just there are times when you have to get up. And the poll tax did show, it really did. It's too, you know, Barbara was born after the poll tax, right, you know. But the fact was, Buggy City came to London. The intuitive, in Aristophanes' Clouds, when Strepsiades finally stops wanting to go to sophist school to make money and just realises there's common decency, the intuitive thing went, and London was full of women in their buggies saying the poll tax is completely unfair, and we all knew it was, and it didn't get through. And I just wanted a moment like that to happen. What did happen last summer, though, was because Royal Holloway is one of the Golden Triangle, it's an old prestigious college that was founded in the 1840s. The Bedford College part, you know, its history goes back to the 1840s. And because it was classics, it was possible to turn it into a debate about, look, this is about the future of the universities. That's all. The debate we hadn't had before. Simple as that. And the wrath and ire of lots and lots of people, a fascinating cross, nothing to do with political parties. You know, it was just fantastically non-partisan. We had Baroness this, Baroness that, Boris Johnson, Terry Eagleton, you know, Valerie Vaz MP, Stephen Fry, Ian Hislop, and lots of others, like wonderful...
Public education workers, all of them? Or?
Opera singers. Lots of... the union was very, very important. Yeah. And in fact, we actually did, at the other end of this political scale, we were very involved with the union workers who were trying to keep the nursery open in the college, things like that. But it really was like that. But the fact is, we haven't had that debate. Nobody has... How can we possibly do that? Birmingham's now on the line, the Institute of Antiquity and Archaeology, 19 people, you know, have been given this exactly the same 90-day penalty shootout. You have this legal thing where you get the 90 days to come up with the counter proposals, the letter threatening redundancy. They always do it just before the summer holidays, like they did last year. But they've learnt from Birmingham, from the Royal Holloway experience, because they've gagged them all. They've made the junior staff who've got them threatened letters sign a thing, and if they break it, they're going to be the ones that get the chop. So I know who they are. We know who they are, and we're having to try and get that debate out there. But the fact is, this country did not get that debate. Now, I think that the old university system, as it stood since the Second World War, is elitist. I think that the middle class have helped themselves to lots of stuff. I think that there's all sorts of debates we ought to have about it. I even think that students should contribute a small amount of their fees to kind of show their commitment, right? A bit of accountability. But the minute you take away from all, you know, the idea, the minute you delete the idea that as a community we haven't got some responsibility to cough up some taxes for the training at a higher level of our young. You know, that is such a tragic moment for this society. And we've been through it and nothing happened. And I think it's now going to be in these micro campaigns instead of, we didn't get the Kratos, the demos did not, sorry, I will finish this sentence, the demos did not get to debate it in the Boulé and the Assembly. So now we're having to do it reactively. I think that's what we're talking about.
And it's very appropriate that the, you know, to let you two, but just say one sentence, this thing that, you know, in ancient Greece, the word for somebody who didn't invest in public life was idiotes, which is where we get our word idiot from. So I think that is a good, that's all you need to know.
So, other questions? Oh, lots. Okay, Harry.
One of the bankers here.
You're not at the top of Barclays, are you?
No. Development bank.
No, I mean, social structures are subject to a sort of brutal Darwinian selection, and if I remember well from the 4 years I spent sharing tutorials with Barbara, the participative Athenian democracy you described lasted about 70 years, and then it was back to normal service. How do you sell this model? I mean, put another way, how do you deal with the Putin argument that people like that says the prime duty of a state is to deliver prosperity, security, and public discourse that threatens that is illegitimate?
Oh, Charlotte, do you want to go for that? Are you up to awake?
I think it is also, despite what Edith has said, it is kind of dangerous to pretend that it was marvellous. And I know this may be a bit
I'm not.
No, but it had great things about it. But I mean, one of the interesting things about, as you'll know as a classics graduate, is just how incredibly contested democracy was, and how it was overturned twice, and how Socrates himself was perhaps not in the sense that he was perhaps teaching the people who began these oligarchic, or one of the oligarchic revolutions, was not himself especially democratic, and was put to death by this democratic society. Which doesn't really answer your question. I suppose it's. I mean, my suggestion is that this particular model we needn't necessarily hold up as an ideal. In fact, almost certainly shouldn't. But what about the Putin thing?
Well, I think we have to find somewhere that's somewhere between Athenian direct democracy of 25 centuries ago and Putin, don't we? I mean, that's a more ideal.
What do you think?
Well, you know,
direct democracy in Russia, very effective.
For being a bit
Squeeze
female
them all into the moon.
Why is the delivery of economic prosperity, why are you taking that as a given? What the Athenians really, really did was take as a given that intellectual, the aspirational, intellectual aspiration.
No, but
my point is that Athens didn't win.
Yeah, it didn't last.
The Roman Empire lasted for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And the Athenian participative democracy.
No, Roman Empire didn't last
we are
that
talking
long,
about
actually,
it.
not like Byzantium.
I mean, it is important that we're talking about it. And I wonder whether Putin will be talked about to the same degree that we now are talking about something that happened over 2,000 years ago. It was flawed, it was small, it was difficult, but it is quite extraordinary to see what kind of influence it's had on foundational moments in human history, from the United States to the French Revolution to all sorts of situations in which that kind of moment that we choose to idealize in ways that are not entirely historically innocent, still has that kind of value. But I think there is something that is coming out here about money that several times all of you said, well, it's not just about money. And then you added the question about stability. And there in Cairo it was interesting, because stability was always the reason why things would go on. And then at some point they don't go on anymore. So it's not so clear, even with Putin, that it is so very stable. We'll have to see.
But there is also...
What about China, where the offer is economic stability, so you don't really need democracy? How long... That's the offer, isn't it, from...
Right. So we'll have to see about... Yes, there are so many questions, yes.
So do you want to get up?
Yes, I think you do.
You were doing your...
If you can,
to stand up,
please,
at the beginning.
Might be having a fair, you know. Extraordinary comment about it. I'm not there, what was my question now? About the practical
ramifications of what you're talking about, because in fact there's two things. Putin is not the worst.
Yeah.
You know, Stalin, what did he do? He brought a place that was incredibly illiterate, and he made it totally illiterate, but the price that everyone paid for that. So that's another pretty grievous example, horrible example of what end justifies the means. In Athens, yes, we want to bring in what Athens had, and we all look at that and there's a lovely warm feeling. But how practical is that, do you think? I mean, that's what I suppose I'm saying. And also this business of money, and that is, you know, how are we going to fund, sorry, this is a huge thing, but how are we going to fund universities going forward unless we adopt, dare we say, an American model going forward in this country for universities? Durham's doing jolly well, and we all want to say that very loudly, but some aren't. So, you know, I'm just trying to ask the practical, what are the practical lessons from ancient Greece that we can bring to cases like Cameron and Osborne and show them?
Well, I'll just say one thing, you can answer more, but I would say the greatest practical example that we can take from us, and it's a philosophical one, but it is by definition philosophy of praxis, is their notion of moderation in all things. And I have to say that if you apply that, you end up with a world where you can be a banker, where you can also have a publicly subsidised university system. The issue, as we know here, is that that scale has gone completely to another side. I mean, we're not going to bash bankers, particularly because there are some in the room, but before the crash...
and some of them might even be nice.
Some of them might even add to the benefit of society and not be idiots. It's, you know, all these things are possible. But before the crash, I was invited to be on a committee of a big charity, and along with a woman who had obviously been invited for her money. She came to the room clearly presuming that everybody in the room was rich, which was why they'd been asked in. A very articulate young woman, so, you know, not an old fogey at all. And she sat next to me, this is what I said before the crash, and she said, absolutely, without a hint of irony, she said, I don't know if she's a hedge fund manager, and she said, I don't know if you're finding this problem at the moment, but we've just run out of things to spend money on. As if she was genuinely, as you know, asking girl to girl my advice. And what do you do once you've got the 4 houses and the 2 boats and the, you know, 6 nannies? Where do you put your money? And I have to say, I did think at that point, this is why we need, whatever we want to call them, public intellectuals, philosophers, thinkers, this is why we do need those people more prominently back in society. Because if she thought for a second about what she was saying, perhaps we wouldn't have the issue, the financial issue that we have today. And I think that is an example of in excess rather than in moderation. But the other two might have something.
I suppose the thing you say is if intellectuals get a better name, and they've never had a good name in this country, the French haven't given them a good name, but we, the English, or the British, or whatever we call ourselves, we do not give. You know, we have an expression to be too clever by half. You can't translate that to any language. Why?
Good point.
Or intellectual life.
Yes.
Which Oscar Wilde talked about. But, you know, what I'm saying is we have 1 in 5 people in this country who are functionally illiterate.
I know.
Now think about that and say how practical you've got to be now in adopting, bringing in Athenian methods. Because you've got to address that.
No, you ask quite astonishingly searching questions, and the reason why I sort of hide in higher education and I'm not out in the world in politics because I can't do that translation in pragmatic terms. I'm actually not the person of it. I'm a dreamer. I do believe in utopia. I think we've got to have utopian thinkers, but I do power think that the human brain is not, we're not trusting it. We are not training it enough, that our combined collective capacity to think ourselves out of not only the ecological mess we're in, but the economic mess and the extraordinary history of international war of the last 200 years, right? No need for that. No need for any of it. I mean, and people are. They really, really are. Steven Pinker is writing books which results of which make you realise that, in fact, we have got less violence totally. And that we can actually get rid of standing armies except for securing national borders. I mean, these debates are beginning to happen. I do think, though, there are actually too many vested interests, and there are very, very powerful links. I don't want to sound like some sort of paranoid, conspiracy theorist, but there are enormously powerful links between the most important disseminator of international ideology, which is Hollywood, and some very extreme right-wing positions and financial monetarist positions. There just are. And they have a vested interest in keeping cinema dumbed down. I mean, stuff theatre, only a tiny margin. I mean, I'm fascinated by theatre because it's cutting edge and avant-garde. A lot of the thinking goes on in it. But I'm far more interested in the utter gunk that is coming out of Hollywood these days. And it's not inevitable. It was not the case in the 1930s. You can have good films like... Okay, I will say it. I actually think Gladiator. No, if we're going to talk classics, Gladiator was a film which had some moral.
This is a controversial territory.
It had a certain amount of moral weight and considered thinking about empire from both points of view. It did. All right.
Shall we move on to the next question?
Well, I actually think this is another bit, educating the public. I do. Ideological education. I actually think this is the most important thing. I won't go on, but I think...
Right. Lucy.
Just a couple of things. Bettany, I like you were talking about moderation. Also, like you saying at one point about people almost being embarrassed about being intellectuals. And do you think that perhaps, and I like when you were saying about moderation, that we always needed someone-led people in society there to think about things like moderation. But do you think that by having certain almost small people who are there to be the public intellectuals, it stops the need for everyone
to think? Yeah, I think that's
Edith talked about accountability that everyone should be thinking for themselves.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and that's why you'll see, I've skirted around this public intellectual idea is a very odd one. I do, though, love the idea of philosophers, because people who love wisdom, that's what their name says. That seems to me to be a good thing in society. Yeah. I mean, what we should, I just think if there's any way, all of us, when we get home now, we can tweet and blog and email and just let's spread this as a viral idea. We're defined by our name. We all belong to mankind. And man comes from a Proto-Indo-European word, manu, which means the mind. So a man is not a thing with a penis. It's a thing with a brain. So I think, and therefore I am a man. And that's what we are as a species. And if we can, exactly as you were saying, Sarah, at the front, if we can encourage people to think, that's what we do best. As a species, we are Homo sapiens things. So if that is a message that can be sent out to every kid from the age of 2, as soon as they can speak and say, speak and think, then surely that is the way that for the next generation, everybody can become a public intellectual or bring intellectuality back into the public sphere.
Loads of questions. Yes, I think you've been waiting a long time.
As I understand it, in Athens, they didn't have political parties.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the really annoying things that I find, lots of others find, is that we can't vote for what we believe in. We can only vote for parties.
Absolutely, it's ridiculous.
It's actually a practical way, from history, where we can actually get rid of parties, and so that people can vote for what they believe in.
Yeah. Well, wouldn't it be fantastic if we could get rid of that agony of, again, a good Greek word, this kind of competitive idea. I just again, tell you this as an anecdote, and only so we can take away and think whether it would work. I went on Newsnight once with 3 other women, and for once, we weren't party political. We were incredibly consensual. We came to a really good, positive decision at the end of this debate. And I came home and watched it pressed my record button and watched it. And I have to say, it was the most boring half-hour television I have ever seen in my life. So there is an issue. Actually, there is also something within all of us that likes competition. There is something in the strife of clash and debate, which is perhaps why we end up polarising into political parties. But what a great idea that we don't need them. Let's bring the polis back, put the polis back into political.
The way I think the polis is coming back in a sense. I mean, I do think, I know this sounds, a little bit airy-fairy, but the blogs, the digital world is a new agora. I mean, there is a way that you can have your voice heard, you can say what you think, you can get an audience. And actually, in a funny way, that sort of speaks back to the public intellectuals idea that, it's no longer that you have to have your great thoughts published in the Times newspaper. I mean, you can say stuff. And of course, but Edith's campaign in relation to Royal Holloway was almost entirely conducted online, and with great revolutions like that at Tahrir Square, were almost entirely conducted. And this is a version of the agora of voices are being allowed to be heard.
What I find interesting there, and what I tell my students also, you want to blog, great, learn to write, right? I mean, there is a skill there that you also have to give that isn't to do with the media outlets writing in the Times, but it has something to do with literacy at the level in which you can put out a blog and it will get... I only read well-written blogs, otherwise I don't want to waste time on stuff that doesn't really have a beginning or end or a point that I can understand. So that, I notice with some of my students, has more effect than when I say you will get a 2-2 in your exam, that it's about that ability to speak. So I think you are saying something that is true.
But the depressing truth is that the blogosphere is a very angry place. You know, you say people, that actually there's some horrific statistic when some people took, looked at a total view of what was going out there, and something like 89% of the views were aggressive and negative, and what does that say about our ability as a species to work together?
Right, on that, so many hands up. Yes, yeah, please, go on.
I want to make a point about direct democracy could potentially be a very, very dangerous thing.
Yes.
If you think about the percentage of people in this country who are in favour of capital punishment, for example.
Absolutely.
How would we have dealt with a massive infringement of personal liberty in that way? Liberty versus democracy.
Absolutely, and what did the Athenians do? They used it incredibly viciously, violently and murderously, committing war crimes. I mean, the people voted to go off and massacre the inhabitants of other islands in the Aegean who dared not to want to be allied with Athens. They voted to cut off the thumbs of the people of Aegina so that they couldn't fire an arrow or hold a spear, that's it. They couldn't hold a spear, but they could row a boat. So they could be, you're absolutely right. And there are sort of extraordinary vivid passages in Thucydides about the people deciding, yes, we're going to kill everyone one day, and no, we're not going to kill. We're going to send a boat so that they don't kill everybody in.
Yeah, but we've
Venus.
only got the right-wing voices. I mean, we've only got Thucydides and Aristophanes. We have not got the ordinary rowers in the Piraeus who felt so unbelievably chuffed that they were actually running their own state. We haven't got them. History has actually silenced those voices.
Corpses, unfortunately,
including Socrates'.
More questions? Yes.
I had a question about money, which I know isn't very English to talk about, but I think it seems to be central to pretty much everything that we've been talking about. In ancient Athens, money, in terms of philosophers, the good ones, Plato, Socrates, didn't ask for money. They just going around doing their stuff. It was the bastards, Socrates, the other ones who were charging for their services, they were the baddies. Today, with the reforms in universities, it's because of money. It's because we need to become because of this consumer society. So how do we come up against that sort of enemy, the fact that we need money, and that it has this horrible power to pervert things in a way that really stymies intellectual growth?
Do you know, I was thinking about Ryanair. I don't know if everybody hates Ryanair. And I hate Ryanair because everything gets a price label. The fact that a mother with small children traveling alone can buy the right to go first on the airplane, which was a courtesy that used to happen like that, is unbelievable. And you start thinking about each and every compartment of life and putting a price. But it doesn't have to be like that. It doesn't,
It's just so honest, isn't it? Yeah. Unfortunately. But I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about Greek thought in the 5th century, and this is a point made by Richard Seaford, who's professor at Exeter University, a rather marvellous book about money, is that, do you think it's ghastly?
I have my differences with it.
Okay. Well, what I found interesting, and you can disagree with this, and I'm probably making this point crudely, is that money was a fairly recent innovation for classical Athens, and it was still close enough to the bone. It's still sort of near enough in the centuries of memory in its invention for it to be almost, sort of easy to critique it in a way that we take it so much for granted. And so you get quite a sort of perspicacious and interesting critique of money a lot in Greek literature. For instance, in the Antigone, when there's an extraordinary amount of fuss and bother about whether Tiresias, the prophet, is giving Creon advice simply for gain, which always is it always sounds peculiar to a modern era, I think. But there's this idea that money is something that we're not quite sure about, and we need to address this poetically.
Well, actually, it's not. Money is as old as Mesopotamia. It's coinage. It's coinage. It's the minute that no. This is crucial. This is what Seaford, where I agree with him, that you've got the Lydians invent coinage.
But that's not money.
No, because you can have you have from way back 4,000 BC people are swapping ingots of things, and that you're converting one product in metallic terms. Absolutely. What happens when the Lydians invent coinage is that you get a slippage instantly between the actual material value of the thing and the sum that is stamped on it, and that is what. And there is the best paragraph in all of German literature in Das Kapital on the moment that gold sein and gold shine, what actual gold and the appearance of gold, which is just the coin that it's stamped on, that is what creates actually, very interestingly, Greek philosophy in all kinds of ways, abstract figures, the ability to think of infinity had never happened before. You cannot think of enough ingots of gold that you can never not use the minute you've got coinage. So the invention of coinage, and shine is still the German for the paper note. It's quite interesting. But that is what causes the first complete alienation of humans from the material importance of what the matter is, if you see what I mean, this abstract system. So that you can and very interestingly, democracy comes along.
Like you say about infinity, there's also that sense of insatiability in relation to money. So is it in Frogs where whoever it is says, you can have enough peas pudding, you can have enough sex, you can have enough of everything. Shoes? The one thing that you can't have enough of is money. It's impossible to say. You cannot say. It was terribly interesting that it's identified poetically. So
it's coins, and the Midas myth, very precisely, he's king of Lydia, comes into being at the precise moment that the Lydians invent coinage. It's actually not just about money. It's about the idea that there is and it's through time. One of the things that most fascinates me about this is, who do you think is the god of coinage in Rome? You think it's going to be Vulcan, because we know all about their fantastic smelting and dyeing and stamping and imprinting. We know an awful lot about it. Is not. It is Janus, because it's the god who stands on the 1st of January and looks forwards and backwards through time. It transcends time. Money is a way of accumulating capital that does actually transcend death, and you can pass it down through your families in a way that, you know, these numbers. And the revolution in the human spirit, both for the good and the bad, that did, I don't think Richard Seaford goes anything like far enough in
if I can say something more general about this, and I'm aware that we should be sort of wrapping up and continuing discussions afterwards among ourselves. So people who didn't get a chance to ask questions, you're not going away, and we will be able to discuss further. But it seems to me that what comes out of this discussion is partly utopian. You know, let's imagine what it was like before coinage. Or, you know, let's have that thought experiment. Let's see how one could arrange one's mind in that way. And that's where the ancient past might come in useful in this very utopian, and the very word utopia is a pun on a Greek word. But then there is the other very practical, what do we do? What do we do about education, about young kids? What do we do about this? What we do about that? And then a slight sense of anxiety, impotence comes in when we think about the practical issues that we need to face. Now, I think that we need to keep these two things in balance, and to think both in this utopian way and in this practical way, and set up conversations of that kind. That is sort of, I think I'm speaking for you, Veronica, really, in thinking about how we might help this kind of conversation go on, so that there are, yes, small-scale practical things that one can do, but that we also allow ourselves that freedom of thinking in a utopian way about the distant future, the distant past, in these ways. On that note, I think we should perhaps stop now, because some people, myself included, might be a little bit tired, but we can obviously continue talking before we go home, and there's plenty more time for people to meet our speakers, and I think you're even better one-to-one, so thank you very much again.
thank Barbara, because it's actually fascinating to get 4 women in a room talking who don't agree with each other. It isn't boring.
Well, that's why I invited you.